talking to Séverine Autesserre. Séverine, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. Séverine is Assistant Professor of Political Science at Barnard College, Columbia University, and is an expert on the Democratic Republic of Congo, where she has done extensive field research. So, Séverine, in your book, The Trouble with the Congo, Local Violence and the Failure of International Peacebuilding, which was published in 2012, you introduce a new approach towards the conflict in the Democratic Republic of Congo. You argue that peacebuilding efforts have mainly been focused on national and regional dimensions of the conflict and have ignored local tensions that have fueled violence in the DRC. And you also introduced the concept of culture of peacebuilding. Now, what exactly do you mean with that term, culture of peacebuilding? If you could expand and explain a little bit what that means exactly.
Of course, I'd be happy to. So what I mean by the peacebuilding culture, let's put it in the context of my work on local conflict, because it's going to make things easier to explain.
Yes.
My research and my book on Congo revolves around two central findings. The first one is that when we try to understand why violence has continued in the Congo despite the official end of the war, we see that violence continues because of the persistence of local conflict, which remain unaddressed. And then when we try to understand why there has been so little attention and so little efforts to resolve this local conflict, and especially so little support by international actors to local conflict resolution, we see that there is what I call an international peacebuilding culture that precluded action on local violence and that ultimately doomed the international efforts. What I mean is that Western and African diplomats, United Nations peacekeepers, and the staff of many non-governmental organizations involved in conflict resolution, they all share a set of ideologies, rules, rituals, assumptions, definitions, and standard operating procedures. And this common culture orients the way they understand violence, the way they think about their role in a conflict situation, and the way they think about solutions, about how to build peace. And so in the Congo, the presence of this peace-building culture explains why there has been so little work on local conflict resolution, so little international support to local conflict resolution, and therefore why the international actors have failed to help the Congolese state build a sustainable peace.
Yeah. In your book you also introduce, within the culture of peacebuilding, issues such as the normalization of violence and a focus on free and fair elections, which is part of this culture of peacebuilding. So can you explain a little bit these two concepts and how this is part of this culture of peacebuilding?
Yeah, well, these two concepts are basically integral part of the culture of peacebuilding, and there are elements that help us understand why there has been so little work, again, on local conflict resolution, which is so important in Congo. So let's take what I call the normalization of violence. It's basically the idea that most international interveners consider a certain level of violence in the Congo as perfectly normal, even in peacetime. So it's decided that, for example, when you read media reports on the Congo, when you talk to people who work on the Congo, they will tell you things like, oh, well, there has been, maybe 10 people killed in this village, but it's the Congo. That's the way it is in the Congo. Congo is as Congo does. And that's, to me, that's illustration and that's indicators of the fact that we perceive a certain level, people, a number of people, perceive a certain level of violence in the Congo as normal. And so what I find interesting is again to try to understand why there has been this process of normalization of violence. And so, well, it's really complicated. I have like dozens of pages on that in my book. But just to make things very simple, very briefly, the first one is that there has been a construction in the 19th century. The Belgian state constructed this image of Congolese so-called inherent savagery, of Congolese people as barbarous, as inherently violent. And that was an image that was constructed to facilitate colonization. And that's something that you can read in the work of Kevin Dunn, for example. He demonstrates very well how this image was constructed. And then he also demonstrates how this image was never really challenged in the 20th century. So it has persisted in the public discourse up to now. And the other reason why, because people who work on Congo, especially people who work for the United Nations, for non-governmental organizations, for embassies, they're super smart. So it's not because there is a stereotype in the public media that they're going to buy into it. But what happens is that all these people usually they are trained to analyze conflict from the international and national level, and they have no training and virtually no framework to analyze conflict at the local level. So when they have to try to understand any violence that's not related to international and national conflict, they have to use frameworks of analysis that are basically whatever they can find. So that will be, oh well, it's the absence of the state, or oh well, it's just because Congolese are inherently violent and because there is a certain level of violence that's inherent to the Congo that's normal for the Congo. So that's what I mean about normalization of violence.
And
elections?
Yes.
it's up to you.
Yes.
Election? Well, that's much simpler. I talk about the obsession about elections because when you look at all the international efforts that were made, and that was especially obvious between 2003 and 2007, so during the organization, the preparation of the first round of general elections in the Congo, virtually all efforts by the embassies, by the foreign ministries involved in Congo, by the United Nations, all of the United Nations agencies, almost all the resources, the financial resources, the human resources, the logistics resources, everything was focused on the organization of elections. And so there was, and really when I was on the ground and I was talking to people, everybody was talking about elections, as if it was the best solution, the silver bullet solution, as if it would resolve everything. You would organize every elections, and then you would reconstruct the state, and then you would end violence. While we know that to reconstruct a state, you need to rebuild a bureaucracy, a justice system, disciplined and effective coercion forces, and you need to select leaders, but that's only one of the many things that you need to do, and same to build peace.
And so what is the problem with this focus on elections? Like, why is it necessarily something bad?
Well, it's not bad per se. Elections are important, and they are one of the elements of democracy. There are to me, there are two main problems. The first one is that when you focus everything on elections, then this focus happens at the expense of all the other things that are necessary to reconstruct a state, to promote democracy, and to build peace. So it happens at the expense again of the reconstruction of the justice system, of the reform of the security sector, of local conflict resolution, which we talked about before, and of promotion of freedom of speech, freedom of media, freedom of assembly, freedom to organize a rally, etc., etc. So that was one of the first things, is that it's basically there is an opportunity cost. And the other thing is that there has been an enormous amount of research by people like Jack Snyder, for example, showing that elections organized shortly after the end of a civil war actually fuel violence instead of promoting peace. So again, being really obsessed and focusing everything on elections right after the end of the Congolese civil war, in effect, fueled violence instead of promoting peace and democracy.